Hey guys, I'm James with Mill Cove Woodworks, and today I want to show you how I built this three-tier nightstand. So for this build, I was given a picture of a nightstand that someone wanted to basically see if I could replicate. And I think I did a pretty good job of doing that. I'm not really sure what style you would call this, maybe coastal, a little bit of farmhouse, but regardless, I think the end result turned out pretty great. And the interesting thing about this build was when I went to my local big box store, aka Home Depot, I tried to purchase the 2x2s for these legs, so 1x6s, a couple of 1x4s, what have you. And they were pretty much out. And by pretty much, I mean they were out of their prime select grade boards. So I had to get a little creative. I did purchase some MDF from there, but everything else that was used in this project was basically made to work from scraps that I had here in the garage. So you'll see me kind of cutting up a lot of 2x6s or 2x4s into pieces that actually fit or work for me in this build. But knowing that it was going to be painted, I wasn't terribly concerned with having 2 or 3 different looking boards or species or what have you. It was all going to be covered up with paint. So anyway, a little precursor into the build. I hope you guys enjoy the video, and let's check it out. So the first step in the process is to work on the 4 bottom table legs. So I'm taking a 2x4 and planing it down to get rid of the rounded edges, which leaves me with a board that is 1 1/4 inch thick. Once that's done, I can then take the measurements for the height, which in this case, each of the legs are 19.5 inches in height. And then I can take them to the table saw and rip them down to the final width. Well, in this case, it's 1.5 inches. And for each of the side assembly pieces on the nightstand, I will need a stretcher to connect the top portion of the table legs. So using the same planed down 2x4, I'm cutting some 15-inch pieces, and then I take those over to the table saw and cut those, or rip those down to their final dimension, which is 3/4 of an inch wide with that 1 1/4 inch height. And the final piece for each of the 2 side assemblies is a spare 1x8 that I had laying around, which I cut down also to a 15-inch length. And then I began putting pocket hole screws in both the top middle stretchers as well as the 1x8. And here, unfortunately, is a step in the process where I messed up. I originally installed the 1x8 flush to the front side of the table, but I had initially planned on that being flush to the back side of that assembly. So had to take that off, start over, and then using the pocket hole screws, attach the 1x8 and the 3/4 inch by 1 1/4 inch middle stretchers. And with that, each of the 2 side assembly pieces are done, and you can probably start seeing now kind of how this is going to come together. And now I can start working on cutting the pieces that I'll need to complete or connect the 2 side assemblies, which will allow me to create more or less the frame of the nightstand. So for that, I'm using the same 2x4 that was planed down and cutting 21-inch long pieces from that, and then taking them to the table saw and ripping them down to that same 3/4 inch width. And the other piece that I'm going to need for that is a matching 1x8 to go on the back portion, and again cutting that down to the same 21-inch width that the stretchers are cut to. So with that complete, now I can start putting the pocket hole screws in the stretchers and the 1x8 so that I'll be able to connect those to each of the side assemblies. And now I'm ready to start kind of connecting those two pieces together and giving me that frame. And I start with that 1x8 piece, making sure that it's lined up with the 1x8 that is on the actual leg assembly. And then with that done, I can attach the 3/4 inch by 1 1/4 inch stretchers, one even with the bottom portion of those 1x8s, and then that opening portion that's left behind will be filled up with the actual drawer. And before I start working on the actual drawer, I'm going to go ahead and build out the top shelf for this nightstand. So the 1/2 inch MDF, I'm cutting down to a dimension of 24 3/4 inch by 18 3/4 inches, which will give me just a little bit of overhang, about 1/2 inch total. And once that piece has been cut, rather than trying to take the measurements for where I need to cut out the corners, I simply flip the nightstand over, lay it on top of the MDF to trace out those cutouts, and then make those cuts with a jigsaw. And once I'm happy with how that fits, I turn my attention to the drawer and start taking measurements for the depth. And for this, I'm using a 1x6 board, and this was actually the only piece of lumber that I did buy from Home Depot. I didn't have any of that laying around. So I make the initial cuts for the two sides and the two front, and then I'll take those over to the table saw and put in a dado cut for the actual bottom shelf or bottom of the drawer to slide into. And I'm using 1/4 inch plywood that I had laying around for this, so it takes a couple of passes over the table saw, but eventually I get enough of a dado cut for the plywood to slide into. And once that's done, I will take the measurements for the actual plywood base, which you can see here is kind of an ugly old white painted piece, but that white will be underneath so it won't show. So I make the cuts for that and then do a test fit to ensure that everything fits the way that I'm expecting it to. And once I'm happy with how everything fits, I will take it back apart and start assembling with glue. And I'm also using 1 1/2 inch 16 gauge nails to tack on each of the edges. And the one thing to remember here is you want to try and use the nail gun on the outside edges so that when you're opening the drawer, that force is being pulled kind of against that nail as opposed to with it, which will help you prevent those seams from kind of pulling apart. With the drawer complete, I can now start working on installing the drawer slides. And I'll be honest, this is by far one of my least favorite parts of any build. And no matter what approach I take, I always seem to struggle a little bit with getting these positioned and level. But I did eventually get everything installed correctly, and the soft close mechanism worked perfectly. With the drawer installed, now I can start working on the actual face of the drawer. And for that, I'm using that same spare 1x8 that I had laying around. I did have to rip this down to a little bit shorter height. But once that was done, I was able to hold that in place on the drawer, attach it from the back side, and that piece was complete. With the drawer now done, I can go ahead and start closing off that area by installing that shelf that I built earlier in the process. So here I'm using glue on the sides of the build and on the back, and also using my 16 gauge nailer just to help hold those in place. And with the bottom half of the 3-tier nightstand now complete, I can start working on the second shelf, which will go on top of the leg assemblies. So using that 1/2-inch MDF, I ripped down another piece to that matching size of 24 3/4 inches by 18 3/4 inches. And once that's complete, I can attach that to the actual leg assembly using the nail gun and some glue. The design that I was trying to follow or replicate had these kind of neat looking curved legs on the top portion of the nightstand, and I wasn't really sure exactly what the best approach was going to be for that, but I ended up just freehand tracing out or drawing out what I thought that curve should look like using a 2x4, and then used the jigsaw to make that cut, which wasn't clean, but we'll clean that up in a little bit. And with the first leg done, I then used that to trace the same layout on a second 2x4, and again, I cut that out with the jigsaw. And with both pieces done, I then clamped them together, and using the orbital sander and a lot of elbow grease, I work those two pieces down so that the edges match and we have two matching pieces. With the curved pieces now complete, I can work on building out or cutting out the rest of the pieces that will make up what essentially is the upper leg assembly or side assembly. So the first thing I need to do is cut some 1.5 by 1.25 inch pieces, and these are cut to 8.5 inches in height to match the curved pieces that I made for the front, and then some 1.25 inch by 3/4 inch pieces to go in between the front and the back pieces. And with the cuts done, I can add the pocket hole screws to the stretcher pieces to attach to that back piece and to the front curved piece. To connect the upper side assemblies to the lower portion of the table, I didn't want to use pocket hole screws, so I used an approach that I've taken with other builds and pre-drilled a hole for the screw to go down into that lower portion, and then I used the Forstner bit to cut out a 3/8 inch hole that I can later fill with a dowel plug. To connect each of the two side assemblies together, I cut out another 21 inch stretcher, that same 1.25 inch by 3/4 inch size, to connect both the top of the side assembly and the back of the side assembly. And then I'll cut two additional pieces for the sides. Again, that same 3/4 inch by 1.25, and I'll attach those to the top of the leg pieces with pocket hole screws. And the last cut that I need to make is for the final shelf or top of the nightstand. So go back to the 1/2 inch MDF and cut yet another piece that is 24 3/4 inches by 18 3/4 inches. And then I can attach that to the upper leg assembly using both both glue and the 16 gauge nailer. And with the table now more or less built out, I can start working on the cleanup process. And the first thing I'll do is start working on plugging any of the pocket hole screws that I left, as well as the 3/8 inch dowel plugs that I used on the upper assembly pieces. The final step before we start painting the nightstand is sanding, and more sanding, and more sanding. And finally we get to the painting process, and originally I was thinking that this was going to be a bit of a bear to paint. It seemed like there was a lot of kind of tight areas and tight spots. It actually turned out a lot better than I expected. Unfortunately, the time-lapse video ran out on me or stopped recording for some reason. But as you can see, I was able to use a small roller to do the large surfaces and really a lot of the actual larger table legs.
and then come in behind that with a brush just to clean it up. But after 3 coats, I think it turned out pretty well.
So there you have it. There's the 339 sand build, and I hope you guys found this video useful, maybe a little bit entertaining, and give me a thumbs up if you liked it, subscribe to the channel, and as always, if you have questions or comments, be sure to leave those down below, and look forward to seeing you on the next build video.